Where did Five Nights at Freddy's lore go wrong? Back in the early glory days of FNAF, when everyone considered that the scariest game ever, the lore honestly still wasn't the easiest to understand, but still, we theorized about things like the killer being the phone guy, and now we have freaking Fastgo and think that Afton is literal code and at the same time also a white lady. So it's unsurprising that some fans once loved and were invested in the story and become disappointed and upset with these decisions the game is taking. So I wanted to take a step back and figure out where FNAF lore went wrong and see what they could do to fix it. Starting in the beginning with FNAF 1, it was evident that the game wasn't supposed to have a big story. This was just a point-and-click game where you survived the big, horrifying animatronics by preventing them from getting to your office until 6 AM. The gameplay was as simple as the lore. All the lore there was literally just told to us by some newspapers, which goes on as following. On the evening of June 26th, 2 local children, which will later sum up to be 5, were lured by a man using a suit of a cartoon mascot. The 5 kids went missing, presumably killed and hidden inside the animatronic suits. They possessed the animatronics and the killer was actually caught by the surveillance cameras and sent to jail. Finally, as people heard about the tragedy and began to notice the awful smell and even blood coming out of the animatronics, the place was announced to shut down later in the year. Also, a quick fun thing I just realized, there's a CEO mentioned here. That's right, although we could say this was Henry Emily, we all know that initially he most likely didn't even exist. Originally, the owner of the restaurant and the killer were actually 2 different entities, The restaurant was to shut down and the killer was sentenced to jail. This was the ending to this quick, semi-hidden horror story, and it would have probably stayed that way if FNAF hadn't been massively well received, with millions of people wanting to see more. So just a few months after the first game's release, Scott Cawthon made FNAF 2, a prequel so he didn't have to mess with FNAF 1's story ending, where he decided to expand on the story many people were interested in by introducing these 8-bit minigames that you can access to every time you die, which revealed some really important parts of this new lore. It gave us our first glance of William Afton, our main bad of the story, and what was probably thought of at the time as his opposite, or the hero of the story, the puppet. We learned that they were originally a kid who was killed by the purple guy and somehow became this weird creature. I'm saying creature and not animatronic, as at the time I don't think she was meant to be one, as she's the only one in the game who can float and was the one shown to make the animatronics come to life in this minigame. Now again, this can all be probably explained with the stuff about Remnant and such nowadays, but I don't think Scott had planned this all out originally. I mean, he literally had just said that he made the story as he went along. Then FNAF 3. This was what Scott says he thought of as the ending of the franchise, but we'll let this slide as it really wasn't announced like that and still left the door open for continuation. So yeah, as he probably wanted to give a more satisfying conclusion to it all, he made this game actually continue FNAF 1 unlike the last one, so he could give the purple guy a better deserved fate, making him suffer the same as his victims by dying and sorta becoming an animatronic, only just a bit more painfully, bringing a bit of retconning from how he's not in jail, but still we can just assume that he could have escaped or something. Talking about the souls, they were also given a deserving conclusion by having them all finally rest. Well, all besides Golden Freddy, who for some reason never feels like it. If the lore was to end here, I think many would have been satisfied with this conclusion, but something Scott didn't expect was how poorly the game's horror was received, everyone deeming it the least scary out of the 3, and as he probably didn't want to end up on a bad note, he decided to make another game. This one would be the scariest one yet, the actual definitive ending as he would make clear by the teasers, and the one who would give an even better conclusion by giving a proper explanation to all of this fantasy and give sense to the senseless. Dream Theory. This hurts to talk about, so if you could please check if you're subscribed, it would really make my day, as it is only one click, won't affect anything, and you can always undo it. Thank you. Although I'm referring to this as a theory, since it obviously wasn't confirmed in the games, it was pretty obvious that this is what the story was referring to. What is seen in the shadows is easily mistaken through the eyes of a child. Remember that? In this game, we learn about the purple guy's sons? The youngest one being terrified of his dad's restaurant, Fredbear's Family Diner, while more so the animatronics in them. The oldest takes advantage of this and tries to scare his brother for his immense fear of animatronics. As he hears horror stories about these animatronics from local kids, that fear increases, and he creates this story in his mind that almost certainly was supposed to be the story from the first 3 games. He sees his dad help employees to put on the animatronic costumes, and in his mind, he probably thinks that he's a killer stuffing their victim's body into them. He hears stories about the animatronics moving around in the night, so he thinks that the presumed victim's souls actually possess them. Everything from the previous games can be explained from this. Freddy, Bonnie, and Chica? Oh, those are just his favorite plushies he keeps in his room. Those horrifying, thrilling jump scares, they come from his brother putting on a foxy mask and literally jump scaring him. The toy animatronics, his neighbor's literal toys. And finally, Springtrap, a decayed plushie of one of the animatronics from his dad's restaurant, Spring Bunny, which they even call a finger trap as it can pinch your finger. It couldn't be more direct. This game and basically the story ends with the kid being hosted at a party in the place he hates the worst, being pulled a final prank by his brother, which ultimately gets him killed by one of the animatronics. Honestly, if this was truly the last game, this would have made for a really creepy and mostly sad story. But we know that wasn't the case, as the fanbase would again not be happy, and it wasn't due to the game's horror aspects. Having been told that this story and characters that many people were in love with, and with all of them being imagined, didn't sit well for a lot of people. And Scott did something I definitely don't think he should have. He listened to the fanbase, and since they weren't happy with this all being imagination, he decided to change his own already finished story to make everything real in the universe, completely dismissing all of these hints he left us and making a big part of this game nonsensical. He created STILL location, and starting from this point onwards, it's pretty evident that the game's lore started going off track, as everything from before is now in-universe real and the explanation behind it was no longer a thing. He decided he had no other choice but to make the story more sci-fi, introducing really stressful stuff that would have made the lore so much better without. Biggest one of them being Remnant, a concept that would get even more complicated as the story went along. Also, having to use these important characters that were introduced in the last game and tell us who we're actually playing as in all of the games if we're not playing as this kid imagining or dreaming all of this. The oldest brother was set as our protagonist, his name now being Michael Afton. Sister Location didn't just attempt to fix the confusion in the story by bringing up more confusing concepts, but also marked the lore as the story of the Aftons. Everything now revolved around William and his family. As much as it explained stuff, it also left open a lot of loose threads. So Pizzeria Simulator was made, aka the real, actual ending, made to do specifically that, tie up loose ends and end the story, explaining even more stuff that didn't make sense as 3 and 3 wasn't canon, adding a few more things that wouldn't really mess up the story to make it more sensical, and getting all the loose ends in a single place and killing them. Having Henry Emily, a character introduced as William's business partner and the dad of Afton's first shown victim, give an incredibly well-ending monologue. And with this game, all the loose threads were tied up. Well, technically all but one. William should not get the same conclusion as the others. He was the villain, remember? So as what was originally an add-on turned full game, Ultimate Custom Night was made, a game to give a farewell goodbye to everything, especially the fans, and tie this thread up. This was Afton's personal purgatory, with all the beloved characters from the past torturing him for eternity. Being honest, although the story took a big hit from the Dream Theory and Sci-fi stuff, it wasn't that bad. These two games tied everything up and gave again, or an even more satisfying conclusion. But what came next is nothing compared to what happened before. Scott got an opportunity to give permissions to an admittedly small but still full team of indie developers to make a new FNAF virtual reality game. This would have been fine, of course, if they didn't decide to implement and continue the story that ended multiple times before, which made sure there wasn't any need for continuation. Even worse, that they didn't even go with a new villain. They continued to use William, adding new meaning to his previous catchphrase. But something to defend all of this was,
we know that Fazbear Entertainment has developed something of a bad reputation, and while it's true that some stories associated with our name were loosely based on actual events, the majority of them were total fabrications from the mind of a complete lunatic. Lawsuit pending.
With the lunatic shown on screen being, of course, a picture of Scott Coffin himself.
This was basically a reboot of the franchise, telling us that these schemes are not factual to the actual events and that this new story is just beginning. We can basically just split this into 2 timelines now, the original one and the post-STILL Love story. Now to the nearest event, security breach was made, and this complicated things even more, completely confusing the new timeline concept we were introduced last game by continuing stuff from the past. Also, the new story aspects that the game was trying to entail was notably a bit confusing, possibly deriving from the troubled communication between Scott of how he wants the game to turn out and STILL Love's capabilities and knowledge of the story. Although I mentioned it before, I'm gonna skip the books for now since it deserves a video for itself, and I need to make clear that I still love FNAF lore and will continue theorizing about the past and future games. Talking about this, using MatPat's most recent FNAF theories, I think we can see how the Ruin DLC will turn out on what's next for FNAF lore. Also wait, we have a Discord now. You can find it in the description from any of our videos, so join it, please. I'm gonna go sleep now. Bye bye, subscribe.